Alright, so the continuation that nobody asked for of the prior video on the topic, like 6 months ago, which was another like 2-hour video on the topic. This is basically me sort of just condensing everything as far as the history of this specific build. Because it's basically been the one I've been using off and on since I've started the game. And then I have done a couple more updates to the build, and it's been reposted to the exhibition. And I have another few tweaks planned eventually, TM, but I felt like showcasing the current iteration of it, I suppose, as far as what it's at for me trying to keep it semi-modular. So for a really brief rundown of what's happened with the build so far. And this is going to be excluding like parts from like battle passes or the armor placements or getting new armor parts and prestige parts and whatnot, because there's been a lot of stuff that's been changed on this build. But yeah, to start with, pretty straightforward. Basically, I started the game and very quickly I decided I wanted the beefy tank tracks. So I bought the Iron Shield pack, and that has a tank paint and 2 Goliaths, which is really neat. It also happens to include a Fatman, which I'll get to in a second. Notably, as somebody pointed out, I didn't notice this myself, but they don't actually have the like side guns symmetrical. So suffice to say, day is ruined if you weren't aware of this beforehand, especially if you were running a variant of this pack like I was for a long time. But in any case, had a Fatman, and then I basically immediately was like, hey, I have really beefy tank tracks. You know what I want? I want a really beefy cabin. You know what a really beefy cabin is? The Bastion cabin, because it has 50% non-energy damage resistance from the front. And then thus this was born really quickly. So the original variant of it was using Fatmans and didn't have any of these fancy flails on the side. And was basically just this bad boy, or something akin to it. I believe I actually had these side by side at one point, but I think they may have made that a bit more difficult with a couple of updates. Now looks like it still works out okay. Yeah, so this is basically, again, sans the armor and the internals, which are, you know, going to vary. This is basically the first really rough implementation of the build I had. So I was running it with the 2 Fatman. I did also run the Wolf's Howl paint, which was from Doomsday Car's Battle Pass, which was the season which I started. So it actually looked more so like that. And then I also had a reworked front underneath and didn't have the side armor, but a very basic, straightforward version of this, more or less. And the name got, I didn't have a name for it at the time, I just knew it as the beefy build I used for everything. And I actually was playing with In Need of Mead somewhere around that time, and as per this question which I asked, which I haven't received a response on, but basically I was playing with them and I was in a party with them and their friend at the time, and they had said that it kind of looks like a slug as this, you know, big honking green slow thing, which I think if you consider having the eye stalks quote unquote up front further, a bit more obvious. Yeah, the interior was a bit different compared to what I have now, just due to, you know, iteration and getting new parts and whatnot. But originally it was running pretty close to that for internals. So I had everything nice and tucked away right on top of each other with, again, the bottom here was also changed. So I don't believe I actually had the large fuel tank there at that point. I believe I just had the frames all the way to the back. But again, over the, you know, iterating on the build over the course of multiple years, I couldn't tell you every change I've made. In any case, sort of started like that, using the amp here, so I could equip the Geagle alongside the two cannons. This was prior to reload boosters being a thing, so that wasn't a factor. Eventually, I actually obtained and used the elephant cannons instead, because unlike the Fatman, which is a brawling plus DPS cannon, turret cannon, the elephant is a tanky, brawling-ish turret cannon. So if you place them staggered from corner to corner like that, so that they are still directly attached to cabin as per the recommendation of pretty much anybody ever, you're still able to more or less have full range. Of course, I'm going to be tilted because of the lack of the Goliath on the other side, but I was able to run this for a rather long time. And this is probably what the most people saw me running this build variant as, since I haven't been terribly active with some of the prior ones. When I was doing this, I was still getting the cannon trial for epic tier done, so there were a lot of battles played with this. I was basically just focused on being super tanky, and then again, of course, I had the cannon separated, had different decor, etc. Once I got to the point where I was obviously affording multiple purples, I did end up swapping out the ammo from a small one for a large one. And then you kind of got something like this. And mind you, I've been pretty much like always a fan of running fuel tanks on stuff, so I was doing that back when, you know, before all of the power score adjustments and whatnot. This was like around the 9,000 power score mark, and I really didn't have issues with running the light generator or the multiple fuel tanks at that point, although of course the entire point of this build is to be ridiculously tanky and have things like not directly on the ground, so it's not vulnerable to fire. Then we had reload modules and a whole bunch of other stuff, different considerations I had. What ended up happening is I ended up settling on using tacklers instead. So I'd been using them beforehand on and off anyway with like other builds, and even with like a similar build for the Goliath tracks, but running the Carapace cabin instead, which is still exhibited in my Fury cabin up on the exhibition, which mixed the elephant and the tacklers. But in any case, I kind of came to the conclusion with the implementation of the reload booster, among other things, that the tacklers and the Bastion were probably a better combination together. Reason being that they both have the 50% damage resistance against non-energy weapons, and I mean, if you're going to have a weakness of energy weapons, might as well have your entire build sort of weak to energy weapons, is my logic. So I felt like they were a really good pairing, alongside them being frontal weapons, alongside a, you know, perk, that cabin perk that really only works from the front. So this was the build version that it's kind of been in as the longest. Obviously, this resulted in taking out the ammo container, and as a result of taking out reload weapons and running 4 tacklers instead, I didn't need to purchase I didn't need to rejig the interior to include a ammo pack or ammo packs or a reload booster, so that was a bit more convenient. And then I was also able to replace the fuel barrel up, the fuel barrel, the small one up there. Could theoretically move these parts around and add another like 3x4 of armor on the top. I didn't end up getting around to it ever because it didn't seem particularly important. And then, as you saw closer to the beginning, running the rear cover parts alongside the fuel tank in the back. So this is probably the version, once again, notwithstanding the changed bottom front and the changed armor placement and the changed decor parts, but this was basically the version that was being run as the longest. I believe at this point I had swapped over to the Solomon's camo as well, which is pretty much what I recall the build being as in the since then. Yeah, pretty straightforward. The power score of this is obviously not displayed properly when I don't have all the parts down. There you go, you're looking at about sub 9,000 power score with the full reputation bonus, which obviously isn't displayed since I took the other pieces off. And then the, option for getting fuel from matches in PvP, as I was completing the machine gun epic trial and then running this in raids as well. Because this amount of health is ludicrous against most bots. So it has 2,600 health, you basically double that due to the cabin perk. I mean, for a while when I was running this, there weren't even Dawn's Children raids. Like the advanced factions, the Firestarters, Dawn's Children, and Steppenwolves were implemented in raids after I'd started playing. So it was literally just the Lunatics, Nomads, and Scavengers, and then the other three came out, and then we've had reworks of the prior three, the basic three. But in any case, this was essentially my go-to raid and PvP build for a while. Pretty convenient, very much a workhorse. Also, very possibly the version that most people would know me for if they'd only encountered me in other matches at around that time period. Then I ended up getting that done, experimented with a couple of things. As you could probably see, I ended up getting the Bastion fused for mass. That wasn't terribly important for the sake of this particular version of the build. As you can see, it was under the max mass limit. If I had to go back and do it again, I would. I've used the Bastion for probably hundreds of hours in Crossout between raids and PvP, so I have no regrets with getting it fused. That being said, knowing then what I did now, if I would get a different fusion, I'd probably look for something that has the damage reduction instead of the decreased mass, just because, I mean, it's a cabin meant to tank, and if you have increased damage resistance on something with damage resistance, it ends up being more effective in theory. So I know that, for instance, it's not additive. So this is a poor example of how it will work in Crossout. But in most cases, if you do have added damage reduction, which is to say if I fuse this for an additional 10% damage reduction, and it applied on top of the 50%, so I had 60% reduction, that leads to another 20% damage reduction to everything I come across, because it goes from taking 50% damage to taking 40% damage. Again, it's not how that works. I suspect it's multiplicative, so it would actually be 0.5 times 0.9 damage, which would be a 55% damage resistance, which is also pretty, assuming I'm doing the math right, of course, and assuming Crossout is doing it the same way I'm expecting it would, which, of course, is pretty much in line with adding, another 10% damage resistance of the 50% damage resistance. So, I don't actually know how it works out. Maybe it ends up being more efficient anyway, just to go with the mass limit and then add a bunch of structural parts, especially because they rechanged the power score, durability, and mass given by all these parts, so it's a lot higher than before. I haven't done the full math because I already had the Bastion cabin fused and I've used it for a bunch. And on the other hand, I'm already running into issues, or have been for a long time, with both the parts limit and the mass limit, and the overall amount of space I can put things on the build. So you can already see I have basically the entire interior between the Goliaths filled, everything above and above behind, and then it's rounded out on the back, and then it goes underneath as well, and there's a block of stuff in front on the bottom as well. So without significantly reworking or starting to expand the width of the build, or looking at trying to get more structural parts from Steppenwolves than exist, it's the sort of thing where I if I were to continue working on this and wanted to absolutely optimize it further, I'd probably look at getting a different fusion, but as it stood, it was a guaranteed fusion at the time, so you just need a second cabin and some resources, and I've been really happy with the results thus far, as well as on other builds. Now, after this, there's been a couple of other things that happened, so I ended up running more epic tier modules, so was able to replace the generator with a gas gen. The way I ended up placing them around is doing a, well, replacement of the fuel tank in the back, as it doesn't want to play this with me there. Fuel tank in the back with the gas gen, and then simply removing the fuel barrel up front, and then optionally removing the radar as well. And then having an additional energy point, so could use a fused chill or an iron seal or whatnot. And then I, would either fill the armor there or leave it. And then alternatively, what I could also do is put those other parts back in when I wasn't doing explicitly raids and when I was running PvP. Then I could kind of fit all those together. Likewise, if I didn't feel like I needed the extra overheating of the RN seal, then I could remove all of these and just replace the entire batch there with a P1 charge, which had more durability. So that was all cool. Bunch of different variants, as you can tell, since the start. Basically, the Golden Eagle and the Bastion cabin and the Goliath are the only things that haven't moved, which has been really great that I was able to set it up once and then not worry about it ever again. Then we got the Averter module, which gives even more damage resistance. Again, assuming it's multiplicative and not additive, so it's not like I get 90% damage resistance if I had the Fusion and the Averter and the Bastion, but still, more, regardless of how the calculation goes together, I mean, the value goes up. The damage value you take goes down. So I was at the point where there was an Averter module, and then there was also me starting to use legendary weapons. Hard raids got reworked alongside their power score requirement, getting bumped up to 8,000 power score. So having the tacklers on the front still worked and was semi-effective for killing bots, but because they focused the cabins, it was very rare that I was getting stripped, and it was very rare that most of the build was taking damage. Normally they were just straight up shooting the cabin and killing it, which, to be fair, I was encouraging by always having the cabin facing them, since that's how I was able to shoot them. But I was sort of at the point where it's like, okay, well, I'm not so sure I really need to be running tacklers anymore, or they'd be effective. So I actually looked at starting to use the Cyclones instead. So I originally had them side mounted, so that I kept the frontal aspect of the build. I could not tell you off the top of my head if I had it up or down like that. In any case, it was attached to the side on the Goliaths. And this was basically doing the same thing, trying to encourage myself to always have the cabin facing towards them so I always get the damage resistance of the cabin. But again, for the sake of doing raids, realistically, it is actually better. Like, it's good to have the Bastion cabin, especially when you're fighting, not Dawn's children who have energy weapons and completely ignore the perk. But while it's useful to have the cabin tank a lot of damage, being able to shoot around to your sides rather than only strictly forward allows you to also use the Goliaths on the side, your armor on the back, as, well, armor rather than just a boost for the cabin. And in general, that's a pretty good way to look at using cabin versus armor health, because when you reduce your cabin to almost nothing, then your armor can still tank like the full damage value that it provides, because when you lose armor, you only lose a relative percentile of your cabin health. And if your cabin health is already really low, removing a relative percentile is like very low durability compared to the actual durability of the part. So what I ended up doing is slapping them on the roof. I will note, I totally forgot to mention, as a result of going to the Cyclones, because they're actually 5 energy each rather than 6 for 2 tacklers, I was able to re-add modules. So at that point I was looking at basically using it strictly for raids. I did do a little bit of PvP in it, and you can kind of see its implementation in the other video, which I'll link in the description. But you could have fuel tanks, or you could again go to the rear cover centered gas gen on the back, or just replacing this with a PU charge, then slapping on another radiator or cooler, and then a averter module if you wanted to, or alternatively a wall hack radar, or at a few different points I tried out the Argus or the Interceptor, or a scope back when they cost energy, stuff like that. Basically you have quite a few options obviously when you have the energy for it. Generally speaking, just for the sake of raids, I just went with the PU charge, just because it was easier to set up, and then if I did get pegged by the off chance enemy behind me with fire that chews through the back parts, I don't blow up because the gas gen gets hit. Extremely rare. Like I said, I've never regretted running a light generator, but in any case it was a potential consideration, and especially for the additional energy just being spent on additional utility, losing the 1 energy point wasn't too big of a deal. So this is kind of where it was sitting for a while, and then like I said, I did end up swapping it around. So I had the roof mounted again in a truly hilariously cyclical nature of history, having the stuff on the top having effectively 6 energy per weapon like the cannons, slapping the additional modules inside, and not having the reload booster or the ammo pack on the inside like that, but still pretty usable overall. Then what ended up happening is, after basically not using the build in preference of significantly higher power score builds in raids, and the remaining weapon trials I have in PvP, had a clan member having some issues with survivability in some specific raids, so I basically reset this up, which is the current one in the save slot, as a version with the fuel tank as well as the amp here. So this is the version that's just been sitting in my garage for that last while since my most recent video. So again, you can see that just for the default it has the fuel, and basically I was using this as sort of a throwaway slot for running the PvP patrols by just removing the fuel tanks, or I could actually use it in PvP for whatever reason, for instance trying it out in arena, which by the way failed horribly, but I mean so did most builds. So it's an ultra competitive space, definitely don't miss it. Certainly interesting while it was around though. And then they asked about, okay, well I guess they didn't ask, I sort of impressed upon them. I'm like, okay, well here, let me just rebuild this for you and then send it off. So that's currently the version that's on the exhibition, which actually surprisingly got more response than most of my other builds, although to be fair, we're looking at a very low bar to clear, of 8 being my highest and 4 being the second highest. But yeah, it's pretty much identical to the one I have, except it has some more internals rejigged explicitly for what they had available, which did include the averter and did include a bootstrap, but it didn't include, for instance, a RN seal, it didn't include a gas gen, stuff like that. So that version, which is basically an update on the one I currently have in the garage, is... oh, I totally forgot to color those on the front. No, they're colored, I'm just dumb. Okay, cool. So looking at how I got that one from this one, it was basically my desire to utilize the bootstrap since they had that generator. That was the highest tier generator they have. I will note the Apollo generator does not fit in this build whatsoever because the interior is obviously severely restricted in space by the width of the Bastion and the tracks. In theory, if you push the tracks out one and then the weapons on the side out further, then yes, you could get additional things, but I'm trying to prevent the Bastion or the Goliath shots from being shot from the front. I really like the overlapping angles of fire of having the tacklers where they are. But as a result, you can't fit an Apollo in the back. So even if you tilted the Golden Eagle sideways, that's 3 wide and you only have 4 wide, so you can't fit a 2 wide Apollo there. And then otherwise, if you don't put the Apollo sideways, it's being represented like that. If you don't put it sideways, you're not going to be able to fit it whatsoever. Like, you can't have it facing like that or that, because it's only 4 wide on the interior. But basically the bootstrap was the highest tier that they had, so I was working around that. I found out that extremely conveniently it fit around the nook of the Eagle almost perfectly. So this is just, honestly, it's been a real good time and time again where, like, all of the iteration I did at the beginning to get the Bastion, the Eagle, and the Goliaths all fitting together, including the armor sort of smoothed around it working, has just been perfect, and I haven't had to touch them since. So that's really convenient. So as a result of getting the bootstrap generator, you can see that you can afford a additional energy point. So there are obviously a few different options available at this stage. What I ended up doing, because they didn't have a RN seal, which would arguably be the best choice for increasing your overall sustained damage, regardless of if it's a fused RN seal or not, is I said, okay, well, this is meant to be an extremely tanky build, so why not just stick with that, and we'll just slap on an inverter and focus on that. Because if you're running the tacklers anyway, like I said, you're taking a lot of damage from the front, you don't have the ability to turn and shoot things beside you, behind you, etc. So having the Averter module is probably going to have a significantly larger effect for the sake of the durability of the vehicle, and pretty much like refusing to die, even if you're literally soloing some of the missions, than having the RN seal, which helps you deal more damage. Now, of course, you know, people's opinions on that may vary, they differ. You can absolutely do your own thing, your own implementation of this. I mean, Bang Shield, another clan, well, recently made clan member, took this idea and built upon and made their own vehicle entirely. So, I mean, this isn't meant to be a example of this is the build and it's the best example of the build and you should use this build. But here's what I've been using for an extremely long time, why it's worked, how it's worked. Here's some additional ideas for tooling around with it, and you know, if it inspires you to go and do something with it, and it's not, you know, a carbon copy of my build, then that's absolutely fine. And arguably that's even better for people to be inspired by what I've done and go and sort of build around. So to that end, everything, you know, the stars just align proverbially again. So as a result of the location of everything, there is this beautiful 2x2x4 gap underneath the cabin, which also happens to touch the frame mounted component pips of the Goliath tracks. So you can actually slap an inverter in there, and you get the damage resistance on the Bastion cabin, and you get it on the 2 Goliaths, which is great. Like I said, it just helps make it extremely tanky. So that's beautiful. It's wonderful. If you did want to swap it out, of course you could run a RN seal up there. So in the one I have posted, I represented that by doing a... what was it? I don't remember. I'm just going to pretend that it was the half wall because it's convenient. So for instance, you could run a half wall there instead. So what I did is I ended up color coding it and saying, okay, well, if you want to run the purple RN seal, you could do that there instead. If you wanted to run the wall hack radar, I didn't color this, but I'm not going to bother re-uploading it. But you could run the RN seal there. Sorry, not the RN seal. You could run the Maxwell, the wall hack radar there underneath instead, because again, it fits perfectly in the space. Whether or not you wanted to move it somewhere else instead, so be it, whatever, what have you. You could run that. You could theoretically run the Doppler down there as well, but as a result of how Bastion tracks work, then it starts like jittering on the ground, which is sub-ideal, especially when you're going over rocky terrain. So I wouldn't recommend doing that, using the Maxwell at most. So just using the different colors to represent the tier of the items, and then obviously the approximate size and shape as a replacement for, okay, if you wanted to replace it, you'd replace it with an item of this color of this exact size and shape, which is generally pretty limiting. Likewise, if you had not yet acquired a RN seal, but you still want it to run additional cooling instead. Then you could run Cypress, do not remember which paint it was. The R1 chill? R2 chill at the back instead. So kind of color code the different module options for it, wherein otherwise you're running, you know, Solomon's pattern or whatever color, you know, choice that you go with for the rest of the build. This is basically just meant to be, like I said, representative of the different modules that you could fit in it with the energy available. So likewise, when I run this build in raids personally, as a result of the prior comments I made in regards to the durability of the craft being ludicrously high when you utilize all sides rather than just the front, I actually replace those with the Cyclones again, and replacing 4 tacklers with 2 Cyclones gives me an additional 2 energy. So I'm also able to run the RN seal there and the R2 chill there. Potentially, you know, swap out the averter or do whatever it is you want with it. Yeah, it's pretty much at the stage where it's almost like a modular system, just because, like I said, the Geagle, the movement parts, the Goliaths and the Bastion basically don't move in between them. So it's ended up being extremely versatile without having to do a whole lot of armor rejigging. It's mostly just, you know, moving the weapons around. I will admit I don't quite recall what I ended up doing for the armor around the averter. I just kind of pulled a lazy move and did that. But obviously, again, as an example, you could choose to do whatever paint or whatever armor or whatever nisism you wanted to do with any of it whatsoever. But that's sort of what I ended up with. So as you can see, pretty easy to swap in between the different options if you so wish. So I haven't saved over this one yet because I have been poking around doing some additional armoring ideas. So for instance, instead of running the APC doors on the back, moving those up to the front, running the APC rear, and then the Dawn's Children observation pod, geez. But it has, like, it doesn't quite have the same angle, which is what I was wanting to do. I was wanting to have the taper on the top and bottom match the taper on the side, which isn't possible with the observation part, and indeed isn't, I think, possible in general. I don't think there's a part that has a 1/2 slope in a, like, 3-dimensional way. Normally the corner pieces are just, well, corner, not like a cube corner, but a rectangle corner. But in any case, just experimenting with different ideas for stuff I could do for adding armor as a result of having the mass fused one. Obviously, if you don't have that, then you end up having a lot less room to work with. But yeah, other couple of things that I will mention that I don't believe made it into the original vehicle, or sorry, the original build, original video, one of those, is I'm just going to finish up the armoring on this real quick so I can save it afterwards. Is that when you do have the block on the front underneath the Goliaths missing, you do have a significantly increased ability to climb terrain. So the Goliath's front slope basically lets them mountain climb if you don't have any parts in the way. So that would be, again, a lot more visible on the Fury build where I explicitly made the front to have as low of a profile as possible so it didn't interfere with the Goliath tracks as much as possible. So for instance, there's a bunch of different, this is just the default garage for what it's worth. There's a bunch of different ramps over there. I don't know what explicitly they're supposed to test or check or whatnot, but I just use them to check like grip and ability to drive up steep surfaces. The steepest surface is pretty brutal for most builds, but the Goliath is actually able to go up it with almost no problem if you don't have anything in the way. So you can actually see it's at such an angle that it actually thinks I'm flipped, but you still have mobility. I would say full mobility insofar as being able to go in any direction. That being said, as you can tell, it goes extremely slow even for the slow parts, but yeah, you have a lot of traction and a lot of wall climbing potential with the Goliath's tracks if you don't have things blocking that front bottom part. So as a result, there is a specific map where that is specifically useful. So that is one called Rock City, which of course you can't assault. You can do domination though. So Rock City is the one with the bridges on the sides, the people immediately attacking each other on spawn as a result of the lack of, divider between them. And then the bridges kind of lead and slope around to the mouth of the map's center. Now, interestingly, I mean, this part shouldn't be news, but if you have enough speed, you can actually launch yourself off of the little ledges on the side of these bridges and get into the center directly without having to drive down or drop or whatnot. Now that being said, as a result of if you do end up dropping, it's very easy to get wedged or caught upside down if you fall off there or here. So I see a lot of people generally not doing that unless they have a significantly fast build and they know they're able to jump across. On this side, it's about 80-90 kph is the sweet spot where you're able to just drive off into the center. On the left-hand side. Alternatively, you could use skinners, but those are kind of gimmicky, and I wouldn't really want to spend energy explicitly to help navigate one map. With a very high skill ceiling, should be worth mentioning. It's really hard to use the skinners in a way to do that, but you theoretically could. But over on this side, the speed cap is only actually like 50, because the ledge has a little gap and then another ledge that's stuck underneath this main platform. But that secondary ledge is actually angled and connected to the main one, so just like, fording the wall with the Fury in the garage, you can actually climb up there with the Goliaths if you don't have these front extremely angled grippy parts, armored up. So obviously on mine, those are blocked because I didn't find that was a scenario I was in a lot. I was finding I was in the scenario a lot where I was getting like physically bumping into people, whether it be as a result of me trying to, get good angles and like just hammer them with tackler shots or pin them or immobilize them because, a 20-ton plus vehicle shoving you around tends to be pretty effective. Or people rushing me or whatnot, or even people throwing fire underneath, or people trying to shoot underneath the Bastion to deframe me, which, to be fair, in this current iteration, there's only the one 8x4 frame holding everything together for the Goliaths, and even on other ones, there was only another, 2 or 3 pips back. Not a whole lot of redundancy on that side. It is kind of funny to note, actually, I forgot to replace this front bit, because it is possible now to use a 2x8 frame part rather than the 2x4 parts that existed before. So there you go, upgrades on stream, people. You're able to directly view never before seen updates to the build. Yeah, but in general, there's definitely a high risk of people shooting underneath of it. And then the Bastion itself, sticking out that front that far with the plow, actually already sort of gimps the ability for these front areas to grip anything. So I ended up just completely filling it in. It's a lot more armored and it can actually deal damage, and it protects the frames from their most vulnerable angle, which is the front, which again, most of the damage is coming from anyway. So I went with that route. You can obviously choose a different one if you so wish. assuming you know, copy the build, you do whatever else. If you don't want to copy the build, feel free to. And then secondarily, if you do run the tacklers specifically, which is why I have them equipped currently, you do actually have a lot of flip resistance, and that wasn't intentional. Like I said, a lot of the things in this build have just, like, I worked things out in a way that made sense, and then I just happened to get a bunch of emergent functionality from them, which has been phenomenal. I didn't intend for this, but basically because the center of mass is so extremely low between using the heavy frames, the Goliath, and the Bastion, which is like bottom heavy to begin with, you are like nigh immune to flipping. So, well, you know, from, I guess, rolling longitudinally, I guess you could obviously still get like flipped end over end or whatnot, but yeah, it's pretty hardcore. Like, even if you land on your side, that was a bad example because I actually landed on my back. But if you land on your side so your tacklers are flush with the ground without rolling over all the way, then you can still see it actually still unflips, which is pretty crazy. You don't get the same effect if you run the Cyclones, generally speaking. Even if you do keep the flails on the side. Because the Cyclones are pretty hefty themselves, especially with the recent updates. And part of the reason why it can unflip, I'm sure, is the shape of the tacklers, sort of like being a level or a roll bar sticking out that's preventing them from rolling as much. So I have rolled the Cyclone version before quite a few times, so you can still see as a result of it being primarily bottom heavy, there's still a bit of resistance, but if I go and like do the like half flip, quarter flip, whatever you want to call it, I'm pretty much immobile for the entire period of the carjack. If somebody rams into me, or if I just back up or move forward for long enough time or whatnot, you can generally get out, but you know, you're still basically waiting the entire time period anyway. So I wouldn't really say it's a viable strat to try and use it as like a bait measure or anything. Goliaths, indeed, Black Mamba. I will say that regretfully you have, well, I guess it depends on whether or not you actually regret it or not, but regretfully for me interacting with you, this is pretty much the end of the stream. But you can backtrack. I'll go back and add chapters, which is not unreasonable since it's a 40-minute video again. But basically just going to reset this up for the tackler version and then resave the slot so I can use it in a modular manner, like I said a few minutes ago before you showed up, to be fair. But if you had any specific questions on the build before I wrap up, you are more than welcome to ask them. Otherwise, there's both this video and then there was actually a original video before this, which I will post in the comments to this video once it uploads the VOD. So assuming you have a fair degree of patience, chances are pretty good I've already answered. Question. Late for everything, yeah. Such is life, my friend. But yeah, I think that'll wrap that up pretty thoroughly. Oh, I forgot to put the soul duck back on the roof. What a fool I am. I need my tank commander up and available. Yeah, so I think that's everything. I will probably continue iterating, like I said, poking around with the armor pieces on the side, especially since I do have a little bit of mass available with the tackler version. Alternatively, I mean, like, I'm primarily not using it in the quote-unquote Hammerhead version as it is, but with the quote-unquote Raidbreaker version with the Cyclones on top. And that's if I use it at all. Again, there's better choices, I feel, for running hard raids and other content. But I will see about continuing to poke around and sort of smoothing out the sides, because current version I have / prior version just included the APC hard modules on the side, where you still sort of have this distinct break between the weapons and the armoring. So, see about poking around with it some more. But overall, certainly not disappointed with the vehicle or how well it's performed for me, or how long it's performed so well for me.